So welcome to this special edition of the Faculty Center. It's special on two counts. One, that it's being held on the fourth Wednesday rather than the first and third. And second, this is so because we have Professor Amit Bhaduri in the city. All of you probably know him. He needs very little introduction. But I will invite him to both chair the seminar and to introduce Professor Amit Bhaduri.
Thank you, Anil. Well, Professor Bhaduri, as Anil said, does not need any introduction, at least to our generation, maybe your generation. Just need a few words. He has been in the forefront of, among economists, or I would say in general, in the forefront of Indian intellectual culture since 1970s. So you can imagine how long he has been.
How long has lived?
Yeah, how long he has lived. You see, in the 70s, he came up with an idea which caught people's imagination, and that was the idea of semi-feudal production relations. You people may not be aware of, or maybe. There was a time in the 70s when Marxism was really in the forefront of intellectual movement in India, and there was this discussion about what kind of relations of production Indian agriculture had, and agriculture was still the dominant sector at that time. And so there were many people who have worked on it in Marxist terminology, Asiatic mode of production, this, that, whether Indian agriculture was capitalist or not, and can we use the Marxist categories to understand and all those things. In that milieu came this idea which he invented, is semi-feudal production relation, which basically was not something like trying to understand categories as such, but trying to understand how poverty is reproduced in Indian village system, and what relations do reproduce poverty year after year after year. So that was a very interesting idea and caught people's imagination, and we all were caught up in that. But in general, as far as his contribution to economics is concerned, at the international level, he's made seminal contributions in the area of growth and development, particularly growth economics and left Keynesian economics, where talk about what generally, if you don't know much economics, you will know this much: if you raise wages, what will happen? Well, if you raise wages, profit will fall, people will invest less, and then it's bad things will happen, inflation will happen, things like that. On those questions, he has pushed back very significantly at a very sophisticated theoretical level. So he is truly an international intellectual. In India, we may know him by his semi-feudal production relation, etc., but his serious economics contributions are of similar nature. But for some time now, again, it seems he has gotten interested in the Indian political and economic scene, and to me it appears that he is trying to develop something of the same nature as semi-feudal production relation type of argument, trying to explain recent development of inequality in India, what is happening and what is generating this, with the growth and inequality which is happening, and what are the forces which are reproducing this, and the refreshing thing about it is that he is not getting caught up into BJP and Congress or this and that, but is looking at it from the nature of the state, modern state, Indian state. And so it cuts through all party lines. You have state provinces, the state in the what we call a state, right? State governments, and you have different kinds of parties moved. Right? So when it is cutting across, it goes not only from Congress to BJP, but it goes even to CPM. What CPM did in West Bengal, and it's not something very different from what Congress and BJP are doing in terms of relationship with land and the capitalist development. So the question which arises is that what is it in the system itself which is acting as if it was a force of nature, so forceful, that it cuts across party ideology, etc., and people are forced in state. The nature of state becomes some way or the other doing this thing, no matter what their ideology happens to be. So I find it very, very interesting the way he is looking at this whole phenomenon and raising it to a theoretical level, which you do not see even Indian intellectuals do. So I am glad that you have come today. You will learn something very, very exciting and new.
Well, generous introductions always do a very big problem. That is, the lecture is a come down after the very good introduction. So be prepared for that. It is true, the articles he mentions and so on, I wrote them. But what I am going to discuss today is something which has been going on in my mind for quite some time, and it is still not a very fully polished idea, but I think it is reasonably articulated now to try and exposition. Now, what I want to talk about is something which is pretty nebulous, that is power, the role of power in various social sciences. It doesn't matter what social science you are doing. I understand there are many people from education, and there are lots of writings, for example, Paulo Freire onwards, about how education reproduces a kind of social structure, helps to reproduce a kind of social structure. How big universities, so-called well-known universities, help to reproduce a social structure, power in a social structure, power in, many writings have been there on education and the relation to social power. There have been similarly by sociologists, this actually should be and is one of their themes. In economics, surprisingly, people are much more, increasingly much more shamefaced about dealing with power. Because whatever we say, we want to feel that it is presented in a form which is logically more tight. And power seems to go out of the grip. Historians talk of power very often without even knowing, but very often power is the centerpiece, whether you are talking about main figures in history, whether you are talking of, for example, what happened to Congress politics, what is happening now to BJP politics. When people write that history, they will see how power among individuals interact. At one level, some people will say that is less important, how it interacts with society, the wider society and so on. But in various ways, power enters the picture. The peculiar thing about power is almost, I gave one lecture on power some time ago, and that was in America. The peculiar thing about power is, the analogy which actually repeatedly, I tried to explain this, but the closest to it is the notion of gravity. We all know that there is, since Newton, a great insight and discovery, probably one of the greatest, certainly in physical science, we all know that gravity is the one which holds, let me stand here and pull me down to the earth, and I don't fly away. Similarly, with everything else, there is a pervasive effect, whether you are talking about, heavenly bodies or you are talking about, there is the role of gravity which binds things together, allows things to together, and so you see the effect of gravity. If you think about it, you see the effect of gravity as a pervasive effect almost everywhere. But you do not see gravity itself as a tangible element. And those of you who know a little bit of school physics will know that there is an inverse proportional law by which you say that the bigger the two bodies will pull themselves in the inverse proportion, how distant they are and so on. Now, this motion with power, we have not a law, we have something very similar which almost every time, if you read on people by people on power, whether they are economists, sociologists, game theorists, whatever, there is a notion which comes in over and over again without being specified. Exactly like, unlike the precision of the inverse square law of gravity, you have something which is called a notion of domination. Now, problem with, and I hope since some of you are students, problem with you should learn to distinguish between words and trying to unpackage the word and see what it actually means. It's very easy to say, power is domination. I dominate, try to dominate over you, and that is power. It's not untrue. But then you can also say that, the master dominates over a slave, the standard example. An employer dominates over a, somebody who comes to work for him for 8 hours a day, dominates. There is a domination, the parent dominates over the children up to a certain age. The children dominate over old parents, grandparents and so on after a certain age. You can think of all sorts of notions of power and domination. And the whole thing is, this different context makes it what you might call a difficult operational concept to use. Because it is, there is a saying in French which says the more you try to embrace, the less you actually do. And it is exactly like that.
No, for the recording, sir.
No, it's a recording.
Recording you, so the recording is necessary.
You have missed the lot of recording.
Okay? Now, it is these different notions of power. Actually, one of the most well-known and great philosophers of the 20th century, Bertrand Russell, once said that, and I have heard it from more than one source. I think he has also written it somewhere, maybe in his autobiography, which is true.
He wrote a book called Power.
He wrote a book called Power, but he said I was going to tell you the history about the book called Power. Apparently he said, and this is a story which I have heard, actually one is not supposed to reveal one source, but it was Joseph Needham, who was in Cambridge at that time. I met him once or twice through Joan Robinson, and he said that, Russell got more and more interested, less and less interested in mathematical logic, and more interested after reading Ricardo in finding out about society and power, because Ricardo's theory had something to do with, how landlords gain or lose power vis-a-vis capitalists, so on and so forth. Now, but he said that when he started reasoning a little bit of economics, he was aghast, because there is nothing which you could see as power. And he said the subject is so uninteresting, because the logic is trivial almost. So the subject is so uninteresting that he said I could not conceivably continue to study political economy. And then he wrote a book which was not very good on power. And the book was not good either. But anyway, let me start with that the simplest way to think of is power as having a very pervasive effect on various things. But we know that it exists, it pervades many things like gravitation, but it is very intangible. Can we make it more tangible? Can we make it something which is more usable in terms of in economics, in history, in politics comes out of it, but in sociology, anthropology, so on and so forth, all what we call social studies or social sciences, whatever the name you want to. Is there a way in which I would try to suggest that there is some way in which we can proceed? As I said, it is still tentative, but I have not found what a mathematician would call a strong counter example yet. So that's why I am willing to say it. Now, to talk about it, let me first quickly see how power is treated in different social sciences. If you look at how power is treated in different social sciences, it's of course a very broad outline sketch, and you would excuse me if it is even distorting, the subjects in many. If you look at the notion of power in economics, mostly economists talk of only one kind of power, and that is power in the market, okay? In the market structure. You say monopoly, one guy rules the market. You say at the other extreme, perfect competition, nobody rules the market. So it is the notion of market structure. The whole notion of economists' notion of market structure defined by how many people interact and what sort of quotation mark power they have. Economists don't do a good job. They have never done a good job with this, because basically what they ended up by doing is to theorize about a market structure. And it still goes on with many Nobel Prizes and so on. They still talk about a market structure where actually none of the buyers and sellers have any power. It is called perfect competition. If you want to explain somebody in one word what perfect competition is, you say try to imagine a situation where the seller has no power, he has to sell at whatever is the going price, and the buyer has no power because he has to buy at that price, and everybody try to take out power as much as possible from the scene, and you get then a beautiful powerless world where in some sense it's an optimum. Nobody can be better without somebody else being worse, and so on and so forth. That is the present state. But as somebody said, when people started going into it, even those who tried to formulate the theory first, when they tried to go into it, they had to say, well, if nobody sets the price and everybody takes the price, then how does the price get set? If you don't think and if you just leave it like a paddock, what is nowadays called a caged paddock, what the Supreme Court said about if you think like a paddock, you would say, well, demand and supply determines the price. But you see, it does not work. But anyway, that is a little bit technical. Let me go into this. Then who sets the price? If you come to the question of who sets the price, then you come back to what? Market. Well, what is the market? That is a market structure. That is exactly what you have to explain. That how does this market structure come in? And to explain this, what was started by the man who actually first set up, he was an engineer, who first set up this elaborate scheme where everybody is coming to the market to exchange and so on. He could see that the sums did not add up. He could not say that how the prices, every individual comes to the market, but what happens if he sells it at a wrong price, for example. It's called false trading. If he sells it at a wrong price, so on and so forth. Sums do not add up. So, like the French philosopher Voltaire, you have to invent, who said that you have to invent a God even if it doesn't exist. And you have exactly the same thing in economics. They invented Walra and Kung and recently many others. They had to invent someone called an auctioneer. The auctioneer is somebody who sets the price, tells, well, the price is 10. How many people are willing to sell at 10? How many people are willing to buy at 10? So then he says it does not match, but he does not allow anybody to trade at 10. Because then it will get into all kinds of problems. You cannot show the market works. Demand and supply works. You wait. You see until the demand, if at 10 demand and supply do not match, then you wait. If demand is too high, you reduce the price a little bit. and see, well, I will now set the price at 9. Does demand and supply match? No false trading is allowed. Until the auctioneer sees that the prices match, nothing is allowed. And when the prices match, he says, that's the price. Now you can trade. The closest is, to some extent, the stock exchange and buying and selling at margin in the real world, but far from it in the sense. But anyway, this is economist invention of an auctioneer or a god who will make a powerless market work. Okay. Now, obviously, this is very unsatisfactory, and there have been several Nobel Prizes and so on trying to say it is satisfactory, trying to say, well, it is unsatisfactory, like Stiglitz and so on. It is unsatisfactory, but it is unsatisfactory not because of power, but a particular manifestation of power. Like what? Like some people have more information than others. Asymmetric information. Akerlof, Stiglitz, and so on, imperfect information. Some people have more information than others. Or you say that because some people have to wait longer than others. So you can invent various ways that, but you know, I mean, it is true. Knowledge, I mean, information is a strategic variable and is very important, but it is not the only variable which determines power. I mean, a slave works for a master, and domination has nothing to do with his knowing that he is being exploited or he is not being exploited. You know, he knows that he might jolly well know that he is being exploited, but he still continues, precisely because of the fact that he has no other way of living and so on. So, you know, this is a very, very partial, this is actually outgrowth. I mean, to me, this, you know, this kind of tinkering with the, what is wrong with, what is wrong with this kind of perfectly conceived market structure, and saying imperfect competition exists here, the banks are cheating you there, you know, the corporations here are really, you know, exerting something which you don't understand, but they are paid media through which this is happening. All this becomes special cases, but the basic analysis of power they are unable to do. They even, I don't think they even recognize that how limited their theories are. The, you know, I mean, I know this group of people who are sort of supposed to be American radicals and so on, so it is basically their framework is still perfect competition, and deviations from perfect competition is what they're working with. And this is how they think of Keynes, this is how they think of Marx, this is how they think of everybody. That there is a market, there is a perfect system somewhere out there as an idealized system, and how much, why do you deviate from it? That is the question. Okay. That is not the way I think the question of power can be understood. I mean, I don't want to go into this one. Then there is a second. I mean, you have a very well-known sociologist, if there are people from sociology here, Max Weber, who worked more or less in the shadow of Marx, you know, around the same, I mean, following him a little bit later. But you see, Max Weber, because he was so much, and this was the liberal, well, let me not go into the, you know, intellectual history of that time. But it was a liberal period. Liberalism was on the rise in economics in everywhere. The individual liberty, liberalism, and so on, particularly in Europe. And Max Weber made this fantastic statement that all class situations which Marx talks about, and actually it has some element of truth, but again, like asymmetric information and power is only lack of information. This is only a half-truth. Max Weber made the statement that all class situations are market situations. I am more or less quoting exactly from him. That everything which you say that I have a power over you, all this same feudalism, this, that, and so on. This is actually, you can translate it into a situation in which I have more power than you, and we are sort of competing on the power in that sense. You know, I mean, you have a greater control over the supply than I have to buy, say, for example, I have to buy salt, but you control the entire, you have a complete monopoly of salt. So you have a considerable amount of power. So everything can be converted into a market situation problem. So all class situations and market situations. On the other hand, you had probably among the economists, one who people say did not do academic economics, but I'm quite fond of his writings and so on, because I think he had insights. He was not very rigorous, but I think damn sight more insightful than most others, who was also an ambassador in India during Kennedy's time, John Kenneth Galbraith. Galbraith used to, that's a good idea, but I think they would not be able to, no, for me it is very good, but they would be able to.
I'm not keeping it very high.
Well, if you have difficulty in hearing, you tell me. You see, Galbraith was among the sort of economists, sociologists. He tried to fusion everything into talking about power almost in many of his books, whether he was talking about the origin of money, or he was talking about the technostructure, or he was talking about the American affluence. In each case, the notion of power in various ways manifested itself. Now, Galbraith had one of the interesting ideas which Galbraith had, again, going back to Ricardo. He said, look, Ricardo's same as Russell. If you read a little bit of Ricardo, I mean, Ricardo is one of the people who actually talks of from the landlord class power shifting or not shifting to the, what do you call them, capitalists, the entrepreneurs and capitalists, okay? I mean, Ricardo tries to understand this in terms of his analysis and so on. Now, Galbraith said in, I think, Technostructure, anyway, one of his books, that you see power basically is connected with shifting of what you call factor of resources. When land was very important, the most critical factor in in economic growth, development, and so on, it was the landlords. However, the power would be, it is very much like the market situation. The power would be with the landlords. But when it shifted to physical capital, it was with a new group of those who were creating the capital, investing and creating the capital, the power would shift to them. The so-called, in jargon, the factor of production shifts, power shifts with the factor of production. Following the same argument, nowadays if you ask somebody who repeats whatever is said by others, in a journalistic way and so on, knowledge economy. We are in the knowledge economy. Power really does not depend so much on human capital. Power do not depend so much on the physical capital which exists in the society or machines and so on, but it actually has shifted to knowledge. Now, true, false, or whatever it is, this was originally the idea goes back to Galbraith, much, much earlier, when he said that, if you want to understand social power, you should try to understand from which factor of production is the most critical, it is shifted to which factor of production, and how it is shifting to the other factor of production. It's not a very deep insight, but there is. And with this, he tried to develop an idea, and he wrote too many books, but he had another book in which he wrote that, with this comes the notion of institutionalization of power, which I will say a little bit, which exists in economics, which exists in sociology, which exists in anthropology, when you study social structures, when you study how people get influenced by ideologies. And there, basically the notion of power is that if you can institutionalize that, for example, if you can institutionalize by saying, take concrete example, that will make it much easier to understand. Suppose you can institutionalize by saying that since you are in Bangalore, it's a good example I just thought of, that if you are in the IT industry, you will get a salary which is 5 times than if you are teaching Sanskrit, if you are a great Sanskrit scholar, or 10 times if you are a Sanskrit scholar. If you are an engineer, you will get 3 times more than if you are a very good physicist. Now, this is institutionalization of, in this case, trivially, it is institutionalization of professions. But through the institutionalization of professions, you can also institutionalize the so-called human capital power as a knowledge and so on. You can do it with power, you can do it with other things, and Galbraith used it, I think, most powerfully in saying that the trade unions, at one stage in almost everywhere in capitalism, trade unions were encouraged by the government. The idea is not Galbraith's, the idea is someone else's, Polanyi's, which goes back a little bit earlier in the Great Transformation. But there are two types of conflict which keeps, or two types of checks and balance which keeps institutionalized power within limits. For Polanyi, it was power which is the power of the market versus the power of the state. Since Professor Ajit Sinha mentioned the state and so on, Polanyi was the first one to say that, look, when I look at the 19th century history of capitalism, what I find is a continuous, what he calls a double movement, a continuous going and coming. Do any of you read Polanyi? Any of you know? Well, he was a great, sort of polymath with knowing many subjects and so on, and wrote extensively on sort of analytical history, sociology, economics, whatever you want to say. It is a book worth at least glancing at, even if you don't read it, which is called The Great Transformation. But basically what he tries to say is that, you see, there is a continuous check and balance in successful capitalism between the market and the state. I used to believe it at one stage, I don't believe in it now, but we all change our views and opinions as we are discussing with time as facts become more. Now, this Polanyi's view was, for example, take in the early stages of industrial development, what you call capitalist development. For example, they used, I'll just give you one example, which is also there in Marx, which is also there in Polanyi, which is also there in many others. When people were sort of losing from the land and they came to the cities and they were at industrial labor force, the so-called proletariat, joined the industrial labor force, they actually were very indisciplined lot. Partly because they are not used to a industrial discipline of coming at a certain time and going at a certain time. That is the simple sociological part. But more, it was found that they did not want to accept this kind of discipline. They started breaking machines, they started delaying techniques, disrupting production and so on. So they found a very interesting way, which you may not know, and which if any of you are interested in gender studies must know, that they systematically got rid of the male workers and put women workers, because the women, they also came to the cities without anything and so on. But the women wanted to raise the children. So they could not be as, they could not revolt, or they could not be as indisciplined as the men. And there is a book by a historian called Maxine Berg, who says, estimates are very vague, but who says it was more than 80% of the labor was provided first by women in the Industrial Revolution. You can see it even today if you go to the garment factories in Bangladesh, the export factories, probably even here, if you go to the, cut flower. I have been to one cut flower place when I was investigating something. So, like there also you see, it's all women working and so on. Precisely because, most of these women, if you talk to them, because they have the family responsibility, which men, for whatever reason, do not feel. And they feel they have to do. So Industrial Revolution was largely built on the women and children's labor. Children, because children, even though they are likely to not work, they had very nimble fingers. So 6-year-old, 7-year-old, 8-year-old children were extremely valuable for cotton spinning factories. So they were brought in. Now, this notion of using, women and so on, as I was saying, institutionalized power, actually in Polanyi's broad thesis, While this was going on, then came the labor laws, about which Marx talks and so on, that then the state, the market actually brought in the women and the children into the force and started exploiting him as much as they could. And that is how the early phase of industrial revolution got going, But, as I said, simplification, but not too much of a simplification. On the other hand, when the, factory laws came, the first round of factory laws came, they were precisely tried to limit the number of hours of work, which still goes on in India, for example, about child labor, that you cannot employ somebody below a certain age, and so on and so forth. These laws came, and from this kind of several examples, he also has examples from the Ottoman Empire and so on. But from these kind of examples, Polanyi tries to make the broad hypothesis that if left on its own, and you will see that there is an element of truth in this, if left on its own, the market tends to go wild and becomes very exploitative and so on without any regulation and so on. On the other hand, when you have the market becoming wild, his view of successful capitalism was then the state intervenes. And when the state regulates too much, the so-called, what we used to call it, the Inspector Raj and so on, then when the state intervenes too much, then again you say that the market is much better, privatized market and so on. So you swing between the two. This was Polanyi's, in essence, Polanyi's double movement. Galbraith took the idea of power. So this was power, institutionalized power between the market and the state. Galbraith took a view which called countervailing power, which I have also used, but in a slightly mathematical form. Countervailing power, where actually you have powers of the trade unions, which is actually encouraged. It's a little bit different from Polanyi. He does not mention Polanyi, but it's a little bit different from Polanyi. The state actually at one stage might even encourage trade unions to come up, to control the capitalists. But at another stage, when trade union becomes too powerful, it is a capitalist. And it is again this double movement between countervailing power. It is institutionalized power. It is power, and power gets institutionalized. He was criticized for this theory to the extent that people said there is not one power. But you can easily see that you can have several centers of power and you can have several centers of institutionalization. This is what is called modern democracy at one level. Modern democracy is one where you are supposed to have different centers of power and different centers of, in an ideal modern democracy, different centers of countervailing power, put together, and the society functions through this kind of check and balance. Not in the textbook, the state is divided into legislative, judiciary, and blah blah. But actually, this is really probably the way in which, when a successful democracy works, to an extent a successful democracy, this is to some extent how it works. It is not just labor capital, but it is several elements of labor versus several elements of capital. One footnote to do this is the Marxist theoretician Gramsci, who added that, when really you are in an extreme situation, like what is called a fascism, when all the power centers, institutionalized power tends to be monopolized by one group, or by one individual, or one party, you are left with nothing. Gramsci was already in jail, and he said that, in his prison notebooks, he says, but there is still one thing which is not monopolized, and that is citizens, what you call the civil society. Many people in the civil society who gain nothing from this monopolization of the state. Actually, many of them suffer from this, and they can form the countervailing power. This was Galbraith's idea of Gramsci's idea of countervailing power. He was in jail. Galbraith had not even come up with the idea, but he used this idea of the civil society as a countervailing power. Reflections of which you see, and then how it gets co-opted and so on. For example, Anna Hazare movement and how it got, I mean, I understand that even in Bangalore there was some ripples of this. This is again the civil society movements and how it get co-opted into an institutionalized power scheme. This is more or less very briefly the level at which the notion of power exists. People have seen power, people have talked about institutionalized power, and people have said how institutionalized power can generate its own countervailing tendencies or can be encouraged to generate countervailing tendencies. People like us, many of these sort of not very mainstream intellectuals who go and support him to say that Sonia Gandhi was the greatest or Modi was the greatest or even Nehru was the greatest, who do not have that kind of a view of the world, they are precisely people who are hoping what? Who are hoping this kind of a thing, that institutionalized power of some sort would come up, which will, to some extent, act as a countervailing force, as an opposing force to too much of injustice and so on. But anyway, but all this leads us where? It does not, if you think about it, and as I thought about it, it tells you, I could have stopped here and I could say that, well, this is how power actually, you see manifestation of power in various forms in the society. And it will not be too untrue, it may be incomplete, but it will not be too untrue. You can actually improve on it, you can produce some game theory, you can produce some particular, if you are interested, if you have a taste for that kind of stuff, you can do that. You can do it in some other way. If you're a sociologist, you can do field surveys. If you're an anthropologist, you can do it, you can approach the problem in various ways, and you will come up with more descriptions which to some extent would support or not support. But is there any kind of operational concept which we can use, which is more general? And I have increasingly come to the belief, maybe if I come again here and talk on power again here or somewhere else, I don't know whether that will be possible, but 3-4 years later, I will probably say that no, that was wrong. But as much as I could see of the examples, the writings, the actual examples, seeing around me how civil society works and everything else, I have come to one simple idea, which probably is more general than any of this. It is not asymmetry of knowledge, it is not. And that idea is power is your ability to close your adversary or adversary's options. Do you understand? That, suppose I have 3-4, it is partly a mixture of what is called game theory, it is partly a mixture of common sense, and it's partly a mixture of what I see around me. That, suppose you say, let us say, if you know English, you have a certain kind of power. If you do not know it, you better know it now. You have a certain kind of privilege, you have a certain kind of power. If you go to the university, you have a certain kind of power in education. If you have a lot of money, if you have inherited a lot of money and so on, you have a certain other kind of power. Okay? If you come from a high caste, you have a certain other kind of power. So there are various ways in which we know that we have or we either have or we are deprived of power. But if you think of all these different cases, what does it do? If you take the caste, what does it do? It creates a hierarchy, of course, but creating a hierarchy means what? That I do not allow you the option. Sometimes it is institutionalized, caste is a very good example, ethnicity is a very good. I do not allow you the option to come up. Okay? And you will see the connection I was making with inequality without being able to make it that day. Second way in which you can talk of power is I am more educated, let's say you are more educated than me. You are more educated than me, and therefore you can speak some English, I cannot speak any English. Okay. Now in this case, what is it? It is you have a language advantage, and not knowing English is an option which for some reason has been closed to me. And in a power situation, either the society or you as an individual, if it is game theory, you as an individual, stop me as your servant, let us say, that you are my servant, you cannot learn English. Manu, the great, Hindu codifier, women and low caste cannot read the Vedas, cannot read the Sanskrit texts. I'm told even now it continues in. Now this is closing your option from rising to have the same kind of knowledge as me. Okay, you can do that. You can do it with language, you can do it with many things. If you go to a good school, so-called good school, and you speak English very well, you have options which other people would not have. And how is it closed? The market will close it by saying good school have much higher fees. Because we are good school, we'll have much higher fees. And we all say, well, that is true. They need to have, if you need to give education, you need to give them, higher fees and so on. But it is a market's way of closing the options, which in a small way appears in economics as called price rationing. You ration out people in terms of prices. You can ration out people in terms of their caste. You can ration out people in terms of their gender. And you call them marginalized, this, that, and so on. So in every way, you can say that somebody, if he does not belong to my religion, he does not have certain kind of advantages which, if he belongs to my religion, will have. That would be also an option. Almost any social situation of power you can think of is actually a way of closing down option. One person who actually tried to say it did not, in my view, did not say it very well because he went too philosophical and too metaphysical, was Marx. He tried to say that, that markets, these people who have lost their land in the, whatever it is, enclosure movement and so on, these people who have been forced to come to the cities, they have nothing, so they have to sell their labor power, and that is what creates the labor market under capitalism. Okay. Now, the option which is closed for them is being, let's say, simple peasants. Okay, it does not mean that a simple peasant necessarily live better or worse. Don't confuse issues. It simply means that that option was there, that option is not there today. In the jargon of game theory, if you want to put it, then it will be, you had many strategies initially. You had the strategy, for example, of being a simple peasant, okay? Maybe with a lower income, maybe with a higher income, but more, And you had the option of moving to a city and living in a, crowded slum and so on, but earning a higher income, or so on and so forth. You might have 2, 3 such options. And if you do gender studies, they don't speak in these terms. You see it even more sharply in that form. A woman can be a so-called, the choice is, very often they're told that the choice is you are a career woman or you are a homemaker. And that sort of thing, it is now becoming a bit faded, but this is, now, this kind of stark options, and then you say that, you have to work from 10 to 5, you would not get certain laws, certain, maternity leave, certain way of childcare, so on and so forth. So, which means you are out. Okay? Now, this is what? You create certain laws by which these options are taken out. You almost think of anything else. With, what shall I say, with Dalits and with, Adivasis and so on, it's just too obvious for any one of us to, I will just tell you one story which I never thought would be true. I had gone, this very, what is called the extremist affected area of Dantewada. We were traveling, and we were at the border of where the, more or less the state's power ends, and so-called the Maoist power and the sort of free tribal moving around and so on begins. So in that area, I remember there was a lot of, the Tatas were taking over some land and so on, and it was in that connection I had gone. So I asked one chap who was a local Adivasi, and this will tell you about, how you get deprived. How power in one particular example. So I asked him that, why are you so much against? I mean, after all, if industry comes here and so on. So he said, I would not get a job. Of course, we could not speak the same language. It was a local journalist who was helping me who was my translator. So he said, well, there is no question of my getting a job. Look at me, I am 40-year-old and, I do not speak even, any language, Hindi and so on. So I said, but, you can move to Raipur, you can move to the capital. And he has never been to, by the way, to the city. That you can come there and you can get a job. He gave an answer which I had never thought of, which we think of isolation, we think of, what do you call it? He said, how can I get the job of a domestic worker, domestic servant? I can't. So I said, why? True interpreter. He said, would you keep me? I still remember it. Would you keep me? How would you tell me? How would I understand you? Because he does not speak a language, he is so isolated. That when we say that, when Medha Patkar and so on, they are destroying the community, this is all verbose. I mean, this is all lots of big words. But in concrete, what it means that if you have only one language, suppose, I am lecturing to you like this, I am put in a village in Tamil Nadu where I don't speak a word of Tamil. I am put there and nobody speaks a word of English or Hindi. Suppose I am put there, what can I do? Absolutely nothing, zero. And this is the problem of, and so when you close the option of these people and we take them out of their community, it's a completely different kind of thing than other kind of problem. I had not realized how isolated communities cannot live outside the communities. I mean, this was a very telling example, and then gradually I began to realize this as the same phenomenon. And this is the same with your language isolation, this is the same with your education. If you have always been in a city and so on, you feel terrible, that how can I live in a village like this? And if you are living in a village with, a different kind of environment, how can I live in a city like this, where I have only 5 by 5 square feet of space? Both you see people in the so-called informal sector and so on. Now, any of these phenomenon, I am not making a moral point, I am not making anything like that, I am simply wanting to understand the use of notion of power as an analytical concept. Any of these examples, if you think of sufficiently, you will see it as a unifying theme. What they all are saying, and that is how it first started appearing to me, not from books, that if I look at 10, 12 such different kind of examples, language isolation, isolation of a region, food, you can blah, blah, you can go on. This kind of isolation, when people are saying, what do they mean? They mean that in my original strategy set, as the jargon goes, or in my original set of choices, it was there. Maybe they are romanticizing, maybe they are saying it, but it was there. I could have done this, and I could have done that, and it is I who decided to do it or not. But somewhere, either the state or the society or the landlord concerned or whoever it is, somebody with greater power than me closed my options. And I'm doing something which I don't like. We always say that what we are doing, by and large, we do not like doing. We could have done something. But this is a little bit different because that option is being closed. Now, this is, I think, the most general way to say how power is manifested. What is not general is how it is, how does this option get closed? How does this option get closed? Vaguely speaking, you could say history. In a different historical situation, you have different. But actually, very often you have very clear actors if you're thinking contemporarily. If you're thinking as a sociologist, if you're thinking as an anthropologist, as an economist, you should be able to, it is the state which is doing it. You may be right or wrong. You might say it is the state which is doing it. It is not the state, but it is a certain class with a certain kind of factor of production, the landlords who are doing it. You can say it is somebody else who is doing it. This way, the one who exercises the power of closing the option is a different, maybe a different guy in a different context. But the effect or the purpose is always the same, to close your options in a way which benefits those who are closing it and for those which is being closed. Thanks. Well, I hope it makes at least some sense. As I said, I'm still thinking about it. And I will try to do it in two ways. I'll try to put it in plain English at one level, and at another level, I'll try to put it in a formal way when it is clear.
So now the floor is open for questions, comments.